And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Tonight's weather again showing this strong low pressure area tracking northwestward across the Gulf of Alaska, heading toward Resurrection Bay by early tomorrow, with a strong front bringing high wind warnings into the North Gulf Coast and along the south coast of the Panhandle. Heavy precipitation for the North Gulf Coast here into the Kenai Peninsula. And winter storm warnings out. Copper River Basin, Anchorage area for heavy snow tonight. Winter weather advisories, mostly for wind here in the interior areas. And winter storm warning for the Arctic coast through tomorrow for winds 35 to 55 miles an hour, creating low visibilities and heavy snow and blowing snow. Next system here tracking eastward and southeastward. Not much of a factor here through tomorrow. This low tracks northwestward, crossing the Alaska Range right around Denali Park late tomorrow afternoon, weakening considerably, so conditions improve here along the North Gulf Coast. And the southeast coast, rain, wind diminishing in the afternoon, strong winds up here to the north into the Chukchi Sea. And then for Friday, this low deepens, tracks northeastward, bringing gale force winds, rain into the southeast coast. More precipitation, but not as heavy, coming up to the North Gulf Coast. Otherwise, Copper River Basin, south central Alaska, colder and drier conditions moving in. Most of the snow out here along the west coast and the Arctic coast, and stronger winds out here over the eastern Bering Sea, down across eastern Aleutians, Alaska Peninsula. Coastal water forecasts along the south coast of the Panhandle. South winds 25 knots for the day tomorrow, with seas 16 to 19 feet. Then we got gale warnings continuing for the north coast up here. South or east-southeast winds 35 to 45 knots, seas as high as 33 feet. Southeast 25 for Lynn Canal, Glacier Bay, Stevens Passage, and Clarence Strait. And then for the day Friday, gale warnings of that next system coming in all the way into Clarence Strait. Southeast winds 35 to 40 knots. Stevens Passage, southeast winds 30 to 35 knots. And Lynn Canal, east winds 25 to 40 knots. South coast, gale warnings, south winds 35 to 40 knots, seas up into the low 20s. Southeast 40 knots in the central coast, again 20 to 22 foot seas. North coast, east winds 30 to 40 knots. And for Prince William Sound, strong winds in the forecast tomorrow. Southeast 45 knots in the Sound with 12-foot seas. Storm warnings for the eastern North Gulf Coast, south to southeast winds 50 knots. And southwest 30 knots for the western North Gulf Coast. Barren Islands, Kamishak Bay, west winds 40 knots. Southern Cook Inlet, west winds 30 knots, seas 7 feet. Northern Cook Inlet, north at 20. And for Friday, Cook Inlet, northwest 15 to 20 knots, strongest south of the Forelands. 40-knot gales continue for Kamishak Bay and the Barren Islands out of the west and northwest. Northwest 25, 10-foot seas for the western North Gulf Coast. Prince William Sound, northeast winds coming down to 25 knots, seas subsiding to 4 feet, and northeast winds 30 to 35 knots for the eastern North Gulf Coast. Kodiak Island tomorrow, gale warnings, west winds 35 knots. The Alaska Peninsula, Pacific side variable 10 to 15 knots. Bering Sea side, northwest 20 to 25 knots. Bristol Bay, northwest at 15. And for Friday, Alaska Peninsula, small craft advisories, west winds 25 to 30 knots, seas as high as 11 feet. Kodiak Island, small craft advisories, northwest 25 to 30 knots with higher gusts, seas up to 10 feet. And Bristol Bay, west winds at 20 knots. Eastern Aleutians, kind of a squirrely wind pattern here from the northeast to west at about 25 knots. Westerlies 30 to 35 knots for the central Aleutians. And out west here, 40 to 50 knot winds out of the northwest for the western Aleutians. And for the next day on Friday, west to southwest winds west of Kiska at 30 knots. Gale warnings on Chitka Island, Adak and Atka. West winds 35 to 40 knots in those areas. Gale warnings also for the eastern Aleutians, west-northwest, 35 to 40 knots, seas up to 17 feet. For the southwest coast, south of Nunivak Island, not bad wind-wise tomorrow, northwest at 15, northwest 20 for the Pribilofs, north 20 St. Matthew Island. Small craft advisories for the Yukon Delta coast, northwest winds 25 knots. St. Lawrence Island, north winds 25 knots. Norton Sound, north at 20. And then for Friday, St. Lawrence Island, much lighter winds, west at 10, west 20 knots here for the southwest coast, but much stronger winds as you head westward here. St. Matthew Island, gale warnings northwest at 35, 40-knot northwest winds with 17-foot seas for the Pribilofs. And for the central eastern Arctic coast, tomorrow storm warnings out, east winds 50 knots, seas 12 feet in the ice-free waters. Gale and storm force winds here for the western Arctic coast, 45 to 50 knots out of the northeast with 12 to 13-foot seas. And for the Chukchi Sea, northeast winds 30 to 40 knots. And then for Friday, coming down on the winds, but still pretty stiff out of the east at 40 knots for the central and western and eastern Arctic coast up here. Seas still running anywhere from 9 to 12 feet. And 20 to 35 knot easterly winds for the Chukchi Sea.